All right. Chapter 13 begins the second major section of John, as I've already told you. Some call it the Book of Glory, chapter 13 and following through 20, with chapter 21 being the epilogue. And so this is an exciting part of the gospel. It's not as long as the preceding chapters. As a matter of fact, I have written notes here, and then I have notes on my PowerPoint, and then notes in the book. But in my written notes, I have 99 type pages, single spaced, and I'm on page 66. So that'll sort of tell you, that we're kind of 2/3 of the way, through in a way. And my goal is to hopefully be able to finish by the end of next quarter. The trial and the crucifixion in that area will slow us down somewhat, but I like to go at the pace that we're going, and so we will continue to do that. All right. Now, last week we started by talking about, what this night was. The Passover was the big question, and so I did as much additional research as I could, and don't have a whole lot more to add, except the Passover was observed at twilight when the new day began, and that was on the 15th of the month of Nisan, Nisan, according to the Jewish calendar. The question was asked whether it was on the same day each year, and it's on the 15th of Nisan, so it would vary. I think, Jonathan, you asked that question, maybe Larry, and so it might vary. It was not always as close to a Sabbath, day as on this particular occasion. And seemed like maybe there was something else asked.
It doesn't run with our calendar.
Yeah, it does not run with our calendar, of course.
It's different on our calendar. It's really.
Pardon, let Ms. Lai pass the observation. What?
It can be really different on the Gregorian calendar, like Easter is.
Uh-huh.
It floats all over the place.
Okay. All right. Now, but we have a special presentation today, and Brother Larry McDuffie has done incredible research, and so at least I sent him a text to that effect. We'll have to see if he. I sent a text to Linda yesterday, and I said, and I was just halfway messing with you, Larry. I said, is Larry all ready for the Passover? And she sent me a text back and said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "He'll understand." So, Larry, you got something you'd like to add? I know you looked it up. You're a good student.
The Passover, basically, I looked up all of the feasts last night and studied and whatever. Didn't know what I was going to be.
We know it originated in Exodus 12, correct?
Exactly. Exodus 12 and 13.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also find it. Deuteronomy 16 is a synopsis of all
Right.
the feast, if you want to go there. And and you mentioned it in the first volume. It's in John 2:13, John 6:4, and John 11:55.
Mm-hmm.
The references that you give to it there, and then there's that if in chapter 5, verse 1.
Right. Did you see anything else on that? I just don't think that's a Passover. In John 5, it just says there was a feast.
I don't know. There were a lot of feasts that they observed.
You could actually write a commentary just surrounding the feast, using the feast of John. Okay, go ahead, Larry.
Well, the three that were required of the males, was Passover, Pentecost, and
Tabernacle.
Feast of Tabernacles, or the Ingathering. They were all had different names too.
Yeah, Tabernacles was called, Feast of Ingathering, Feast of Booths, and then the Feast of Dedication that you have in John is also called the Festival of Lights, and also Hanukkah. And it is not mentioned in the Old Testament, because it was a man-made, feast, but observed by Jesus and others in celebration of the rededication of the temple. You got anything else to add to us?
That Judas Maccabeus was the feast of dedication.
Right.
There. Okay.
Who was the guy that sacrificed the hogs? Anybody know?
Antiochus Epiphanes.
Yeah, okay. That was a bad thing, wasn't it? What he did.
He was a bad dude.
Yeah, he was. Okay. Anything else you want to add, Brother Larry?
No, sir.
All right, anybody else want to add something to that? Jonathan, did you have any other questions on it? John?
Something that has confused me, and I've heard the explanation, why they were eating the Passover now, which Jesus and his disciples, as opposed to talking about the preparation day when they would, be ready for the Passover. But I guess I've heard it explained that the Galilean Jews observed it a couple of days earlier than typically.
I'm not real sure about that.
You'll have to look at it.
You mean the preparation day?
Eating this feast here with his disciples.
Uh-huh.
Passover.
Yeah. Well, this is the Passover feast. I believe in John 13.
That the whole city was observing?
Well, here's part of the problem. If you have your new commentaries, turn to page 5 if you would. And it'd really be helpful if you could read. I know you've got a million things to do during the week, but if you could read a little bit, you might find it helpful. But this is about the middle of the page, about C of the page. The Synoptic Gospels teach that Jesus and his disciples celebrated the Passover together. It's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. According to the Jewish calendar, this would have been right at the transition from Thursday evening to the onset of Friday. We've already talked about that after sundown. However, the time note of John 13:1 and other references in John have convinced many commentators that John understood the Last Supper to have taken place the night before, on Wednesday evening, which I do not accept. So some have made this feast, John, the day before, the night before. That may be what you're referring to. But this reckoning places the crucifixion on Thursday afternoon when the Passover lambs were being slaughtered at the temple in preparation for the approaching Passover feast. And I've read many who have cited that and said that idea of the slaughter of the Passover lambs, really fits with, the death of Christ. And the idea is great, I think, because Jesus is our Passover lamb, correct? But, according to 1 Corinthians, but I think the time note is what I'm concerned about right now. Anyway, such an understanding causes John to conflict with the other Gospels in terms of chronology. And of course, we know that the Gospels all agree, don't we? Why is that? Because everything agrees in the Bible, doesn't it? It's inspired. If there's any, see, God gave us minds to determine, as you've talked about, Brother Elon, about alleged discrepancies, in the Scriptures. At any rate, if you look on page 6, here's how I tried to sum it. The most plausible solution is to maintain that the Synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are correct in the chronology, and the phrase before the feast of the Passover, see, which is mentioned in John 13, might help if I got there. I was in 1 Corinthians 13. What's that about? Anyway, see, in John 13 it says, now before the feast of the Passover. Here's what I decided. I decided before the feast of the Passover should be understood to refer to the narrative that just followed, namely the washing of the disciples' feet. And that's the significance of that phrase. Jesus had with his disciples, covering chapters 13 through 17, but only as an introduction to the foot washing episode. So John's account is consistent with the synoptics. So if this is true, then any subsequent references in John mentioning a feast yet to come must refer to the Feast of Unleavened Bread and not to the Passover itself. Now you remember the Passover is like the beginning, correct? And then you had this 7-day feast, that took place, called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is sometimes referred to as a Passover, itself. So it gets a bit confusing. But I think, for example, in 13, where Jesus says in verse 27, after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. Then Jesus said, what you do quickly. But those at the table didn't understand. And so they thought Jesus was saying, buy those things which we need for the feast. Well, what feast is that?
It would be
It's got to be the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Because see, they're in the Passover feast, now. At least that's my understanding of it. All right, kind of complicated, I know. I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out all these dates and work through Matthew, Mark, and Luke and all. But I think John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke really focus on the Last Supper, and John just does not do that. Just like the the institution of the supper. Some people think, and we talked about this, that John 6 has to do with the institution of the Lord's Supper. But I discounted that, as well. John 6 is talking about, sharing with Jesus, being in fellowship with Jesus. Where he talks about eat my flesh, drink my blood. You remember that in John 6? And I know it sounds a little odd to some, but I have maintained that John 6 is about the Lord's Supper, but that the Lord's Supper is about John 6, but John 6 is not about the Lord's Supper, if that makes any sense. I don't think attention's being called to the Lord's Supper in John chapter 6. But John omits a lot of things, like the Garden of Gethsemane account. He omits that. I've told you before, 92% of John is not found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So the question might be, hang on just a second, the question might be, why would John not talk about the Lord's Supper? Well, if you think about it, if John was written in the last 2 decades of the first century, do you think the Christians might, have pretty good knowledge of what's going on the Lord's Supper? You see what I'm saying? Where the early gospel writers might have felt more compelled, of course, under the direction of the Holy Spirit, to say more to the early Christians about the Lord's Supper. So you have to remember too the dating situation. John is several decades, after the other Gospels. Okay, Brother Larry had his hand up first, Doug. Larry?
The only thing that comes to me is the Passover was one day. It was like that event took on one day. But the Feast of Unleavened Bread, in other words, the Passover was celebrated for like 7 days, which rolled it around to the 8th. So it's like Passover's one day.
And then Feast of Unleavened Bread.
That whole week is unleavened bread.
Right.
Where they're basically celebrating the Passover and remembering.
And so that's the reason I think, as in that verse I just noted in this chapter, that the disciples thought when Jesus said, what you're going to do quickly, the disciples thought that Jesus was telling Judas to go buy something for the feast, which would not have been uncommon. If you read this, the shops were left open late and so forth. Okay, that's all I can say about that. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, Doug. My apology.
That's okay. So based on your statement a minute ago, is it your understanding then that the early Christians were already partaking of the Lord's Supper whenever John was written?
Well, I think so. Because, the Lord's church is established, on Pentecost, 50 days after the Passover, Acts chapter 2. And so, we're talking, what's the date we give for that? What is it, Jonathan? 4? Or, no, I'm sorry, I was thinking about Jesus' birth. I thought that was weird when I learned about Jesus' birth. It was 4 BC or something. I can't remember. Some of y'all remember that?
Something like that.
It's a kind of a weird, it registered weird to me, but the Lord's church, AD 33, of course. Well, here's John writing, I think I decided about 85, but it could have been, as late as in the 90s. And so they've been observing the supper for, what is that? About 50 years or so. So I think that's the reason that John too mentions, so many other things other than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because he writes so much later. And there's only a few things that he repeats, like the feeding of the 5,000. All gospel writers, mention that. But you even say in 21, we're going to get to the restoration of Peter. None of the other gospels say anything about that. And I had a whole list. I don't know if you can remember as far back as we were at the beginning of class, but I had a whole list of things mentioned by John that were not in the other writers. Okay, can we move on? All right, let's look. All right, now. Yeah.
So why would, I guess this part I'm kind of confused on, why would Peter refuse to have his feet washed initially when he wasn't the first? So he saw other disciples getting their feet washed. Why would he then, out of the blue, say, I don't want my feet washed?
Well, I don't think we're at that verse yet, are we?
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just throwing that out for consideration. Okay, if you don't mind, let's hold on to that, all right? Because that's going to take us down to about, verse 6 or so? Yeah. Is that okay?
No.
Well, it's going to have to be okay. All right. Okay, now notice he said his hour had come. We've already talked, we know about that. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So now that was a big question. In a way, it's big to me. What did end refer to? Well, we know what the word end means, but it can refer to the uttermost, like he loved them to the uttermost. Or does it refer to something else? Does it refer to like the end of, toward his death? Whatever it refers to, it's significant, isn't it, that he loved his disciples. All right, the supper being ended. All right, now we've got to say something about that. The New American Standard, which is an incredible translation. It's the American Standard of 1901, updated a little bit, especially with attention given to the verbs. And the New American Standard says during supper, which is, I have a footnote down at the bottom of my Bible where it says the latest, the earliest text, read during supper. So what shall we say about that? All right. I think it was during supper in a sense. But, all right, here's what's going on. The supper, you need to understand, the supper, the main part of the supper is not going on at this point, okay? It's kind of like you'd go to a meal with somebody and you're gathered around and you know how it is. There's still, activity going on. Someone's in the kitchen and they say, oh, you wanted decaf coffee? Okay, I'll get that. And so, stuff is still going on, okay? The meal is not way underway, all right? And so during that time, Jesus decides to do something. Do all of you see that the meal is not well underway? At least that's my thought on it. It's not well underway. So the event had begun, but the actual eating of the meal had not necessarily taken place. And so the rendering during supper is really more preferred than the supper being over. See, some people read the supper being ended and they think, well, it's all over with now. But that's, I don't think that's the case.
Or wasn't the tradition to have your slave wash your visitors' feet as they came in anyway?
Right.
So you wouldn't do it in between courses.
Right. Now, what happens at this time then? The devil does something, or something happens related to the devil.
Says he entered into. Judas.
Okay. And it's, the original language, bears out it could be the devil's heart, that the devil decided in his own heart. It says the devil already put into, the New King James makes it the heart of Judas, which I think is correct. He put it in the heart of Judas, Simon's son, to betray him. Now the question we ought to ask here though is this: did the devil make Judas do that? You remember the comedian Flip Wilson? You remember that skit that he had, "The devil made me do it"? Is that what we've got going here?
Could Judas have resisted doing this?
Yes, of course he could. So the devil couldn't have made him do it, right? Well, how do we know that? How do we know what Jenny just said? Could Judas just, Jenny, sorry, Judas, Jenny. Jenny just said or asked, could he have resisted? And we know that he could have. How do we know that?
The Bible says there's always a way of escape.
Right. 1 Corinthians 10:13, there's always a way out. But what about 1 Peter 5:8? Isn't it resist the devil and he will flee from you? So and I think that that's a powerful note. And I think maybe I've preached on it here. I can't recall. But with everything that the devil throws our way, there's always a way out. The Bible says that, doesn't it? Always a way out. 1 Corinthians 10:13. And the Lord will never put more on us than we can bear. And so what should we say about Judas then?
I think Judas is already of a character, maybe that he would have been weak and would not have resisted, but he could have.
Well, we know
He
was always
could
a
have.
thief, that he was stealing
Right.
money.
I mean, he was of a
So-
poor character anyway.
So his commitment was not as deep as the others.
Right.
He
Well,
still had that.
his major flaw was love of money. Right? Remember the Bible says in John 12, we talked about this, that he was a thief and used to take what was put in the bag. I don't know if you've watched any of the Chosen series or not, but that comes out pretty plainly. When Matthew goes to the bag, to get some monies, do y'all remember seeing that scene? And what did he say to Judas? Do you remember, Jonathan, what he said? He asked Judas, he asked Judas about it, and he kind of snapped at him or something. But, we confidently say he's a thief because the Bible says that.
David,
Yeah,
James says every man is drawn away of his own lust.
right,
And enticed.
right. It's just, I've told my preacher students, now over 50 years, I said, we're all human beings. Some of us have greater weaknesses than other people. Isn't that right? In our task, 2 Corinthians 13:5 says, examine ourselves, right? So we need to look at ourselves and find out, what is my real weakness, and then what? Avoid any and all circumstances that would attribute to that. Brother Jonathan?
I've heard Alan try to answer this a few times, and I frankly remember how he answered it. How do you reconcile God's foreknowledge with our ability to make choices?
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, we know that God is omniscient, correct? So He knows all things. The best that I can do on that, Brother Jonathan, is to say that God knows what we are freely going to choose to do. But to say that He knows...
Even before we were alive, how did we get to choose? Judas, it was way before Judas was even alive that God knew he was going to do this.
That's right.
How did he get to choose?
It's rather, to use a word that I have a hard time saying, an unfathomable thought. I got it out. To think about the fact that right now God knows the ultimate destiny of every one of us. Is that correct? He knows that. But to say that He knows what we will freely choose to do is quite different than to say that He determines, what we will do. Now, why would we say He does not determine? Because that would reflect on His infinite holiness and His infinite justice, wouldn't it? Oh, hang on just a minute, Elon, because just think about it. You know what double predestination is, don't you? You know what predestination is. Most people think that God predestined some to be saved, but there's the thought that He predestined some to be saved and He predestined some to be what? To be lost. Well, I mean, immediately, that says to me, well, that's just crazy, teaching, because that would reflect on the God that we worship. The God that we worship is infinite in His holiness, in His justice, in His goodness, and so God could never do anything like that. Elon?
God said, Hezekiah, you're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
Hezekiah turned his face to the wall, prayed. He didn't die.
That's right.
15 more years.
I don't know if that totally answers our question, but it does for me.
Well, it shows that, Hezekiah had a change of heart, correct? And God in turn, changed, didn't He?
Sure did.
It doesn't mean that He's changed as far as His nature is concerned. But over and over in the Old Testament, did He not say to Moses and others, if they will hear my voice, then I will bless them, etc. And then they don't hear His voice, and then He curses them, and then they do hear His voice, and so forth and so on. But that's the best I can do with it. Jonathan, what did Alan say?
Yeah, I struggle to remember.
Oh, okay. All right, Brother Dan.
God predestined the plan.
Did He? Now, God predestined, now let me say, glad you mentioned that, Dan. God predestined from all eternity that everybody in the church, that remains faithful to Him is going to be saved. He predestined that His plan, was going to be fulfilled, right?
But some people won't agree to it, so some people don't. So are they not predestined?
Well, I'm not sure I understand exactly.
Free will, though.
If they freely choose to not be part of the plan,
Okay, well, He predestined the plan. We agree with that. So He knows some are going to agree to it, some are not going to agree to it.
right?
In a sense, did we all get predestined one way or the other?
We're all predestined to be saved if we obey His will, and to be lost if we do not obey His will.
I get that.
Look at Romans 8:29. One of y'all turn to that for me real quick. Hang on just a minute, Linda. This verse is right on your point, as I recall. Make sure. Can you read it, Jonathan? You got it?
For whom He did foreknow, He also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many.
Yeah. He predestined that we would be conformed to the image of His Son. That was His plan from all eternity. But some reject that plan. Okay? Larry, Doug? Y'all can't give us some incredible insight here? Okay. All right, Ms. Light.
I think him knowing what will happen does not mean he interferes with it.
Right.
He doesn't say, okay, well, I know he's gonna be a loser, therefore I'm just gonna make sure he makes that choice.
It's kind of
Doesn't
like,
do that.
right, if I could use this analogy with parents and children, it's sort of like, this may not be exactly a good analogy, but let me try. Let's say here's a parent and here's a child that's, a certain temptation is going to come to this child. How many of us have ever said, well, we know what he's going to do, or we know what she's going to do? You see what I'm saying?
People say she'll be just like her mother.
Yeah. We have a pretty good idea, of what our children are going to do, given certain circumstances. Well, God knows infinitely what everybody's going to do by their own free will. That's the only way that we can, it's called theodicy. That's the only way that we can give a justification for God. All right, Bruce.
Well, He put Judas at that spot, so at the beginning of time, He knew that he was going to miss. And He had to have him to do that, to be the thing fulfilled.
But see, that raises a, what happened? What did I do? I'm still hooked up here.
Your battery?
I'm okay, Garrett. I'm green. There we go. See, that raises a question that many people have asked, and it's a hard question. Did God select Judas, even before he was born, to be the son of perdition? And I can't accept that, because, see, that goes against the nature of God. It's just like saying, my doctoral dissertation was on a divine command theory. Is something right because God says it's right, or is it right because it is right? Some say that a divine command theory would be that that God could make whatever He wanted to, right or wrong. That it's like flipping a coin. So He could say, well, let's think about adultery now. Do I want that right or wrong? I think I'll make that wrong. Well, I don't know. Maybe I could make that right. See, God can't do that. There are some things that God cannot do. He cannot do anything that goes against His infinite nature. So if He's infinitely good, He could not make murder right, or stealing right, or lying right. He can't make any of those, things right, because it goes against His nature.
But Jesus picks, He did pick him.
He did.
So if it wasn't in God's plan, because God didn't predestine that.
Right.
He didn't predestine that Judas was a sinner.
Here's the answer, I think, Bruce. Jesus knew what Judas was going to freely do. Isn't that right? So since He knew what he was freely going to do, He selected him.
That was my whole point.
In John 17, when He prays to the Father, He says, I've kept all of them. Remember that? Except one. And I lost one. Okay, somebody else had. Elena, did you have your hand up?
I did. I was going to ask.
Here, you return the ball. Here you go. Here you go.
From what I'm hearing you say, is it possible that God is, I'm trying to figure out how to word this.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? I'm with you. Excuse me.
Is it possible that God basically knows what somebody's going to do, but there's a little inkling that they might not?
He knows. Best I can say on that is God knows everything.
Okay.
He knows what you are going to freely choose to do.
So Judas comes along, and he's just a likely candidate for something
Well,
like betrayal of the Lord. Because of his weak nature.
Jesus knew what He was going to do, but He did not influence him. He did not tell him to do it. He did not make him do it.
But I think he knew out of his 12 that this was the one that was.
Right. He knew Peter was going to deny Him. He didn't. He knows, the destiny of every person in here, but He knows what we're freely going to choose to do. Hang on, Doug. David.
We get to talking about God's knowledge and so forth. This may be too simple, but God's not restricted by time. We're dealing with everything in a limited space.
Right.
All right. So when we think about what God's knowledge is, it has to be beyond what we can understand. The simplest thing I can explain is that we've all stood on a high place on a mountain at some time, and when you look down in that valley, you can see a road that starts on the left and comes across that valley and splits and divides and ends on the right. And if that's our life, God sees the beginning. He sees every turn in that road where we end up.
Right.
He sees that.
Right.
And He can stand on that high spot and see the beginning of the world and the end of the world.
Right.
Where we are caught and just trying to deal with that.
I'm glad you made that point. I frequently have said, it's kind of a philosophical point, but there is no past and there is no future with God. You ever thought about that? It's only present. You see, the Revelation, I forgot the passage, says Jesus was the Lamb slain before the foundation of the world. See, God sees it all. He sees everything is present, with Him. He sees as though it's already done. And in His mind, it is done. See, it's not in our mind, though, like you say. We see things in a linear fashion. I remember when I was a kid and I just started, studying the Bible after my mom and dad became Christians. I was 11 or 12. And I was reading that passage in Peter, like one day is how many with the Lord? 1,000 years with God. And I got thinking about that, and I thought, okay, now it's in the morning, and by the next morning, 1,000 years has passed, with God. In my teenage mind, that's what I was thinking, but that's not the case. See, there is no time, with God. And
The mind of God and the mind of man are two.
Exactly. We just really can't comprehend it. I just know this. I know the Bible is His Word, and I know what He told me to do in order to be saved, and I'm going to do it. Right?
Well, also, if there had not been a Judas, there would have been someone else. It
Sure.
wasn't like, well, Judas could have changed his mind and it never would have happened. No.
No, God would have worked out His
Jesus
plan.
was going to be
Right.
crucified.
Okay, let's move on so we can get to Victor's point, okay? All right, now, let me try to summarize. In verse 3, I love this verse because it says essentially this: Jesus knows that He's from the Father. He knows He's going to the Father. He knows everything, and nevertheless, He rises up from supper, lays aside His garments, takes a towel, and girds Himself with it. I call this chapter Jesus the lowly servant. I'll wait on that. But anyway, let's see. Hang on just a minute. Okay. Let's see. I brought something I wanted to show you, and I forgot. I'll just go ahead and tell you. This is where the supper took place. If you believe that, I got a Brooklyn Bridge to say, okay? But it is believed this was built over, where the place. I've told you before, like Jacob's Well, it's under a structure. But anyway, all right, now, so this is just an amazing thing that He girds Himself, with this towel. It's the towel of a bondservant. Now, let's see if I can get on over to all right, here's some washing of the feet. Victor, we're getting there. I wanted to show you this real quick. This is one picture I have found of one of the foot washing bowls, as it were. Hey, like that. Had you ever seen this before? Well, there you go. I actually prefer this one right here a little better myself. That looks like it'd be more comfortable than this, but maybe not. Depends on your foot, I guess.
Well, that could be both feet at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I sort of looked at this as I don't know. Actually, I looked at it as your foot and your heel on one and the front part of your foot on the other. But anyway, there you go. And then this, of course, is an ancient picture taken by one of the apostles. No, just kidding. Of course, you know this, don't you? Leonardo.
It's probably not accurate, is it? Wouldn't they have been on?
It is incredibly inaccurate. Okay? In the first place, there's not a single person there that looks like a Jew, is it? And it's not the table. I appreciate Leonardo's heart, but it's not. This is it right here. And that's about the best I can do with it. This is the way that I think John 13 is arranged, okay? First of all, and you've heard me say this, I remember in some sermon I did, I referred to this, I think it was here, that the tables were about 18 inches high, and most of us are right-hand dominant, and so they would lean on their left elbow and then eat with their right hand. And I wish, I wanted to ask Jonathan and Larry and Doug to demonstrate this, but no. But anyway, I could. If they're like me, we can't get off the floor. Okay. I called Linda one day and I said, would you come out here for a minute? And she came out and helped me get off the floor. Most of the time I plan ahead. If I got something I can pull up on. Anyway, I want you to think about this and please read. So think about them leaning on their left elbow. So look, if I'm lying down leaning on this elbow and here's someone in front of me lying down leaning on their left elbow, then that helps us understand where the Bible says that John is in the bosom of Jesus. Because see,
Just lean back.
all John did was this right here, you see, to Jesus. Now, guess who would be on Jesus' left side?
Judas.
Probably Judas.